The schoolyard was loud with laughter, but not the kind that warms you. It was the cruel kind, aimed at a 7-year-old boy whose shoes were nothing more than scraps of leather tied with twine. Every step he took drew mockery. Daniel kept his head down, whispering to himself just to keep moving, until a man in a tailored suit stepped forward. He wasn't a teacher, and he wasn't a parent. He was a millionaire CEO. And that morning, in front of dozens of children, he made a choice that would change all their lives forever. The morning air was cold, sharp enough to sting a child's skin, and the small boy's steps were uneven as he walked toward the schoolyard. His shoes, if they could still be called that, were more patches of fabric and cracked leather than footwear. The soles had peeled away in places, tied together with twine that bit into the fragile material. Each step made a flapping sound against the pavement, the kind of sound that drew eyes, not out of kindness, but mockery. "Look at his clown shoes," a voice shouted from behind him, followed by the laughter of 3 boys his age. The boy's ears flushed red, but he didn't turn around. He just gripped the strap of his faded backpack tighter and kept walking. His head hung low, and his thin hair fell across his forehead, hiding the shame in his eyes. The laughter followed him all the way to the school gates. The other children, polished in neat uniforms, shiny sneakers, and bright coats, looked at him with a mix of amusement and disdain. He was used to it, being invisible when they didn't want to notice him, and being the joke when they did. His name was Daniel, 7 years old. And though no one at that school knew it, his world at home was harder than any test they would take in class. His mother worked 2 jobs that barely covered rent and food. His father, well, Daniel never talked about him, not even to himself. That morning, as the laughter grew louder, Daniel whispered something under his breath. Just get to class. Just keep going. But before he could slip through the crowd, one of the boys darted in front of him, blocking his path. It was Marcus, the ringleader, the tallest boy in his grade, and the loudest whenever Daniel entered the yard. "Where'd you get those, Danny?" Marcus jeered, pointing at his shoes. "Out of the trash?" The other children giggled. Daniel's face burned, and for a moment he thought he might cry. But he didn't. He couldn't. He forced himself to look at Marcus and said nothing. Silence was his only defense, though it made Marcus sneer wider. "Bet your mom buys them with the pennies she finds under vending machines," Marcus added, shoving Daniel's shoulder. That's when a deep voice cut through the laughter. "Is this how you spend your mornings? Laughing at someone smaller than you?" The yard went quiet. Even Marcus froze. Standing near the school gates was a tall man in a dark tailored suit. His shoes gleamed, his tie was straight, and the sunlight caught the silver watch on his wrist. His presence was so commanding that for a moment the entire schoolyard seemed to shrink around him. The man stepped forward, his gaze locked on Marcus and his friends. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that silenced whispers. "Go on," the man said. "Say it again. Say it with me standing here." Marcus's mouth opened, then shut again. He muttered something about being late and pushed past his friends, disappearing into the crowd. The others followed quickly, too embarrassed to be caught. Daniel blinked up at the stranger, unsure if he should thank him or run. The man looked down at him then, his expression softening. Slowly, deliberately, he crouched down so his eyes were level with Daniel's. The expensive suit creased at the knees, and the sight of someone so powerful kneeling before him stunned the boy into stillness. "Your shoes," the man said gently. "They hurt your feet, don't they?" Daniel swallowed. His throat felt tight, but he managed a small nod. "Why don't you ask your parents for new ones?" the man asked, his tone curious, not judgmental. Daniel hesitated. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mom, can't. She says maybe next month." The man's eyes softened even more. He understood in that moment this wasn't about laziness or neglect. This was survival. He extended his hand. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy said quietly. "Well, Daniel," the man replied, "my name is Jonathan. Jonathan Hale. If the teachers had overheard, they might have gasped, because Jonathan Hale wasn't just any man. He was a millionaire CEO, a name printed in magazines, the face of international business panels. But here, kneeling in a cold schoolyard, he wasn't Jonathan Hale the mogul. He was just a man looking at a boy who reminded him of something he thought he'd buried long ago, because once, years before, Jonathan too had walked in shoes that didn't fit. And that morning, in front of dozens of children, Jonathan made a choice that would change both his life and Daniel's forever. The morning air was cold, sharp enough to sting a child's skin, and the small boy's steps were uneven as he walked toward the schoolyard. His shoes, if they could still be called that, were more patches of fabric and cracked leather than footwear. The soles had peeled away in places, tied together with twine that bit into the fragile material. Each step made a flapping sound against the pavement, the kind of sound that drew eyes not out of kindness but mockery. "Look at his clown shoes!" a voice shouted from behind him, followed by the laughter of 3 boys his age. The boy's ears flushed red, but he didn't turn around. He just gripped the strap of his faded backpack tighter and kept walking. His head hung low and his thin hair fell across his forehead, hiding the shame in his eyes. The laughter followed him all the way to the school gates. The other children, polished in neat uniforms, shiny sneakers, and bright coats, looked at him with a mix of amusement and disdain. He was used to it, being invisible when they didn't want to notice him, and being the joke when they did. His name was Daniel, 7 years old, and though no one at that school knew it, his world at home was harder than any test they would take in class. His mother worked 2 jobs that barely covered rent and food. His father, well, Daniel never talked about him, not even to himself. That morning, as the laughter grew louder, Daniel whispered something under his breath. Just get to class. Just keep going. But before he could slip through the crowd, one of the boys darted in front of him, blocking his path. It was Marcus, the ringleader, the tallest boy in his grade, and the loudest whenever Daniel entered the yard. "Where'd you get those, Danny?" Marcus jeered, pointing at his shoes. "Out of the trash?" The other children giggled. Daniel's face burned, and for a moment he thought he might cry. But he didn't. He couldn't. He forced himself to look at Marcus and said nothing. Silence was his only defense, though it made Marcus sneer wider. "Bet your mom buys them with the pennies she finds under vending machines," Marcus added, shoving Daniel's shoulder. That's when a deep voice cut through the laughter. "Is this how you spend your mornings? Laughing at someone smaller than you?" The yard went quiet. Even Marcus froze. Standing near the school gates was a tall man in a dark tailored suit. His shoes gleamed, his tie was straight, and the sunlight caught the silver watch on his wrist. His presence was so commanding that for a moment the entire schoolyard seemed to shrink around him. The man stepped forward, his gaze locked on Marcus and his friends. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried an authority that silenced whispers. "Go on," the man said. "Say it again. Say it with me, standing here." Marcus's mouth opened, then shut again. He muttered something about being late and pushed past his friends, disappearing into the crowd. The others followed quickly, too embarrassed to be caught. Daniel blinked up at the stranger, unsure if he should thank him or run. The man looked down at him then, his expression softening. Slowly, deliberately, he crouched down so his eyes were level with Daniel's. The expensive suit creased at the knees, and the sight of someone so powerful kneeling before him stunned the boy into stillness. "Your shoes," the man said gently. "They hurt your feet, don't they?" Daniel swallowed. His throat felt tight, but he managed a small nod. "Why don't you ask your parents for new ones?" the man asked, his tone curious, not judgmental. Daniel hesitated. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Mom, can't. She says maybe next month." The man's eyes softened even more. He understood in that moment. This wasn't about laziness or neglect. This was survival. He extended his hand. "What's your name?" "Daniel," the boy said quietly. "Well, Daniel," the man replied, "my name is Jonathan. Jonathan Hale." If the teachers had overheard, they might have gasped, because Jonathan Hale wasn't just any man. He was a millionaire CEO, a name printed in magazines, the face of international business panels. But here, kneeling in a cold schoolyard, he wasn't Jonathan Hale the mogul. He was just a man looking at a boy who reminded him of something he thought he'd buried long ago. Because once, years before, Jonathan too had walked in shoes that didn't fit, and that morning, in front of dozens of children, Jonathan made a choice that would change both his life and Daniel's forever. Jonathan didn't stand right away. He looked carefully at the boy, studying the way Daniel tried to keep his shoulders squared despite the humiliation. That resilience, Jonathan remembered it too well. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather card holder. "I want you to give this to your mother," Jonathan said, handing Daniel a small card with his name embossed in silver. "Tell her to call me today." Daniel frowned, hesitant. "Why?" Jonathan's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Because I think she and I need to talk." The bell rang, and the children began filing toward the doors. Daniel slipped the card into his backpack, his heart racing. For the rest of the day, he couldn't stop touching it through the fabric, as if it were a secret too heavy to carry and too valuable to let go. Meanwhile, Jonathan Hale sat in the back seat of his black town car, the driver navigating through the morning traffic. His assistant beside him rattled off schedules and boardroom updates, but Jonathan wasn't listening. He was staring out the window, replaying the sight of Daniel's broken shoes and the way he'd tried not to cry. For reasons Jonathan couldn't yet explain, that image cut deeper than any quarterly report or billion-dollar merger ever had. The morning passed in a blur for Daniel. He sat at his desk, staring at the chalkboard, but the lessons seemed to bounce off his mind like pebbles on glass. His fingers kept brushing the card hidden in his backpack pocket, the card with silver letters pressed into thick paper. Jonathan Hale. He didn't know what it meant, not really, but he knew enough to sense that it was important, that it was different. No one ever looked at him the way that man had, like he wasn't a joke, like he wasn't invisible. At lunch, Daniel sat at the far edge of the cafeteria, his tray holding nothing but a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. The other kids had bright plastic lunch boxes filled with snacks and fruit, things his mother could rarely afford. He chewed slowly, wishing the bell would ring sooner. 2 tables away, Marcus and his friends still snickered when they caught his eye, but their voices weren't as loud as before. It was strange. Marcus had looked scared when the man in the suit spoke to him, really scared. Daniel tucked that thought away, almost like a treasure. When the day finally ended, Daniel ran home, his shoes slapping against the pavement. The small apartment smelled faintly of cleaning products. His mother had been working the night shift again. She was at the table, hair pulled back, eyes tired. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile was weak, stretched thin. "Hey, Danny," she said, reaching out to brush his cheek. "How was school?" Daniel hesitated. He wanted to lie, to say fine, the way he usually did. But the card in his backpack burned against his thoughts. He pulled it out carefully and slid it across the table. "A man gave me this," he said quietly. "He said you should call him." His mother frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel before picking it up. She read the name, and her face went pale. "Jonathan Hale?" she whispered, as if the name itself was too heavy for the room. "You know him?" Daniel asked. She nodded slowly, almost absently. "Everyone knows him. He's one of the richest men in the city." Daniel's eyes widened. "He talked to me today, at school." His mother's head snapped up, alarm flashing in her expression. "What? Why?" Daniel looked down at his shoes, the twine cutting into the leather. His voice was small. "The kids were laughing at me. He told them to stop. Then he knelt down and talked to me. He said you should call him." His mother's throat worked as if she were swallowing back something sharp. She stared at the card, then at her son's broken shoes, and for a long moment she didn't speak. Finally, she reached for the phone on the counter. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number printed on the card. The call connected after 2 rings. "Hale," a calm voice answered. Her breath caught. "Mr. Hale, this is Daniel's mother. You told him to have me call." There was silence for a beat, and then Jonathan's voice softened. "Yes, thank you for calling. Can you meet me tomorrow? Somewhere neutral. A cafe, perhaps." Her instinct was to say no, to refuse outright. Men with power rarely meant safety. She had learned that lesson the hard way. But something in his tone stopped her. It wasn't commanding. It wasn't arrogant. It was sincere. "All right," she said quietly. "Tomorrow?" When she hung up, her hands were shaking. Daniel watched her, unsure if she was angry or afraid. She pulled him close, pressing her cheek against his hair. "Don't get your hopes up, Danny," she whispered. "People like him, they live in a different world." But Daniel, in the innocence only a child could have, whispered back, "Maybe he's different." The next afternoon, the cafe hummed with quiet conversation and the hiss of an espresso machine. Jonathan Hale sat at a corner table, his suit impeccable, but his eyes distant, lost in thought. He had told himself this was nothing, just a meeting, just curiosity, but the truth was deeper. The sight of that boy had cracked something open inside him, something he had kept sealed since his own childhood. When the door opened, he saw her, Daniel's mother. She wore a plain blouse and an old coat, her hair pulled back neatly, though exhaustion lined her face. She carried herself with quiet dignity, the kind born not of privilege, but of survival. Daniel trailed behind her, clutching her hand. His shoes flapped with every step. Jonathan stood immediately. "Thank you for coming." She hesitated before sitting across from him. Daniel slid into the seat beside her, his wide eyes fixed on the polished man before him. Jonathan didn't waste time. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Your son told me you couldn't afford new shoes for him." Her jaw tightened, shame flashing in her eyes. "With respect, Mr. Hale, that's none of your concern." "Maybe not," Jonathan admitted. "But I watched your boy stand in front of a crowd of children mocking him, and he held his ground. That takes strength. Strength he learned from you." Her eyes flickered, caught off guard. Jonathan reached into a small bag he'd placed on the chair beside him. He set a shoebox on the table. Inside was a pair of sturdy sneakers, clean and new. Daniel gasped, staring at them as if they were treasure. "I don't want charity," his mother said quickly, her voice sharp with pride. Jonathan shook his head. "It isn't charity. It's an investment." "In what?" she demanded. "In him," Jonathan said simply, glancing at Daniel. "In his future. I know what it's like to walk in broken shoes. I know what it does to you. And I know what happens when just one person decides you deserve more." For the first time, his mask of polished control cracked. The truth slipped through his words like a confession. Her eyes softened, confusion mingling with reluctant curiosity. She looked at Daniel, who touched the shoebox with trembling fingers. And in that small cafe, something shifted. Because Jonathan Hale hadn't just given a boy new shoes, he had opened a door neither of them had expected, and none of them knew yet where it would lead. The silence at the cafe table stretched longer than Daniel's mother expected. She kept her chin lifted, determined not to look small, though the weight of Jonathan Hale's gaze pressed down like a spotlight. She had walked into this meeting expecting pity, or worse, condescension. But the man across from her seemed intent on something else. "Take the shoes," Jonathan said quietly, almost gently. "Not for you, for him." Daniel's hand hovered over the box, hesitant, his eyes flicking to his mother. She closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled. "Say thank you, Danny," she whispered. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice trembling as he slid the box toward himself, fingers brushing the lid like it might vanish. Jonathan smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The moment passed, But it wasn't really about shoes anymore. It was about what they represented: dignity, hope, the possibility of being seen. Jonathan sat back, his expression softening as he studied the tired woman across from him. "May I ask your name?" he said. "Claire," she answered after a pause. "Claire Miller." "Claire," he repeated, testing the name as though it mattered. "Tell me, what do you do?" Her lips tightened. "I clean offices at night, and I serve tables in the morning. Whatever pays the bills." Jonathan nodded slowly, though something in his chest twisted at the thought. He remembered his mother's hands, red and raw from scrubbing floors, her back bent from work she never complained about. "And Daniel's father?" he asked carefully. Her face shut down instantly. "Not in the picture." Jonathan didn't press. He knew that tone. Some wounds weren't meant for strangers to prod. Instead, he shifted. "I'd like to help, not just with shoes, with more than that." Claire stiffened. "Why? Out of guilt? Out of pity? Rich men don't show up in cafes offering help to strangers for no reason. What do you want from us?" The sharpness in her voice might have driven off another man, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't want anything. I want to give what I wish someone had given me when I was his age, a chance." The honesty in his tone startled her. She had spent years dodging false promises, empty words, men who wanted more than they gave. But there was something different in the way Jonathan Hale spoke. He wasn't performing. He wasn't even convincing her. He was remembering. She searched his face, looking for cracks. What she found instead was sincerity that scared her more than arrogance ever could. "I'll think about it," she said at last, gathering her bag. "But don't expect me to be someone who owes you." Jonathan gave a small nod. "I'd never ask you to." Daniel hugged the shoebox to his chest as they left. At the door, he glanced back at Jonathan and gave the smallest smile. Jonathan watched them go, his jaw tightening. He had a board meeting in an hour, a multi-million-dollar negotiation that would decide the future of one of his companies. But his mind wasn't on profits. It was on a boy walking out of a cafe with shoes he should have had years ago, and a mother who carried too much weight for one pair of shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan Hale felt something he thought he'd lost: responsibility. That night, Claire placed the new shoes on the table. Daniel stared at them as if they were made of gold. "Try them on," she said softly. He did, his feet slipping easily into the cushioned sneakers. They fit perfectly. Daniel stood taller, running a few steps across the living room carpet, his laughter ringing out in a way Claire hadn't heard in years. Her eyes stung as she watched him. She hated how much relief one pair of shoes could bring. Hated that it took a stranger's kindness to give her son what she had been breaking herself to provide. She looked at the card again. Jonathan Hale. Why would a man like that care about a boy like hers? She didn't know. But something told her this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. His penthouse overlooked the city skyline, glass walls reflecting towers of light, the very empire he had built. Yet for all the wealth surrounding him, his thoughts kept circling back to a boy with broken shoes. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the glittering city. He had spent years perfecting control of markets, of companies, of his own emotions. But this felt different. It reminded him of his own father, a man who had walked out when Jonathan was 9, leaving him and his mother to scrape by on nothing. He remembered the nights his mother skipped meals so he could eat, the cold winters when heat was a luxury. He remembered the shame of standing in classrooms with worn-out shoes and kids whispering behind his back. He had sworn he would never feel powerless again. And now, decades later, he saw himself in Daniel. The whiskey burned down his throat, but it didn't dull the ache in his chest. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jonathan called his assistant. "Clear my schedule this afternoon," he ordered. "Sir?" she asked, confused. You have 3 back-to-back meetings, including—" "Clear it," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument, "and find out everything you can about a woman named Claire Miller." There was a pause. "May I ask why?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. "Because I owe a boy more than just a pair of shoes." When the report landed on his desk, Jonathan read it slowly. Every detail, every struggle. Claire Miller, 32, working 2 jobs, raising her son alone in a cramped apartment in one of the city's tougher neighborhoods. No criminal record, no debts, except medical bills from when Daniel had been hospitalized with pneumonia 2 years ago. Jonathan closed the file, his chest tight. He had built skyscrapers, toppled competitors, and bent markets to his will, but none of it made him feel the way that simple file did, and because it reminded him of how easily life could break the ones who fought the hardest. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hale decided to get personally involved. The silence at the cafe table stretched longer than Daniel's mother expected. She kept her chin lifted, determined not to look small, though the weight of Jonathan Hale's gaze pressed down like a spotlight. She had walked into this meeting expecting pity, or worse, condescension. But the man across from her seemed intent on something else. "Take the shoes," Jonathan said quietly, almost gently. "Not for you, for him." Daniel's hand hovered over the box, hesitant, his eyes flicking to his mother. She closed her eyes for a moment, then exhaled. "Say thank you, Danny," she whispered. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice trembling as he slid the box toward himself, fingers brushing the lid like it might vanish. Jonathan smiled faintly. "You're welcome." The moment passed, but it wasn't really about shoes anymore. It was about what they represented: dignity, hope, the possibility of being seen. Jonathan sat back, his expression softening as he studied the tired woman across from him. "May I ask your name?" he said. "Claire," she answered after a pause. "Claire Miller." "Claire?" he repeated, testing the name as though it mattered. "Tell me, what do you do?" Her lips tightened. "I clean offices at night, and I serve tables in the morning. Whatever pays the bills." Jonathan nodded slowly, though something in his chest twisted at the thought. He remembered his mother's hands, red and raw from scrubbing floors, her back bent from work she never complained about. "And Daniel's father?" he asked carefully. Her face shut down instantly. "Not in the picture." Jonathan didn't press. He knew that tone. Some wounds weren't meant for strangers to prod, and instead he shifted. "I'd like to help, not just with shoes, with more than that." Claire stiffened. "Why? Out of guilt? Out of pity? Rich men don't show up in cafes offering help to strangers for no reason. What do you want from us?" The sharpness in her voice might have driven off another man, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't want anything. I want to give what I wish someone had given me when I was his age. A chance." The honesty in his tone startled her. She had spent years dodging false promises, empty words, men who wanted more than they gave. But there was something different in the way Jonathan Hale spoke. He wasn't performing. He wasn't even convincing her. He was remembering. She searched his face, looking for cracks. What she found instead was sincerity that scared her more than arrogance ever could. "I'll think about it," she said at last, gathering her bag. "But don't expect me to be someone who owes you." Jonathan gave a small nod. "I'd never ask you to." Daniel hugged the shoebox to his chest as they left. At the door he glanced back at Jonathan and gave the smallest smile. Jonathan watched them go, his jaw tightening. He had a board meeting in an hour, a multi-million-dollar negotiation that would decide the future of one of his companies. But his mind wasn't on profits. It was on a boy walking out of a cafe with shoes he should have had years ago, and a mother who carried too much weight for one pair of shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Jonathan Hale felt something he thought he'd lost: responsibility. That night, Claire placed the new shoes on the table. Daniel stared at them as if they were made of gold. "Try them on," she said softly. He did, his feet slipping easily into the cushioned sneakers. They fit perfectly. Daniel stood taller, running a few steps across the living room carpet, his laughter ringing out in a way Claire hadn't heard in years. Her eyes stung as she watched him. She hated how much relief one pair of shoes could bring, hated that it took a stranger's kindness to give her son what she had been breaking herself to provide. She looked at the card again. Jonathan Hale. Why would a man like that care about a boy like hers? She didn't know. But something told her this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. His penthouse overlooked the city skyline, glass walls reflecting towers of light, the very empire he had built. Yet for all the wealth surrounding him, his thoughts kept circling back to a boy with broken shoes. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the glittering city. He had spent years perfecting control of markets, of companies, of his own emotions. But this felt different. It reminded him of his own father, a man who had walked out when Jonathan was 9, leaving him and his mother to scrape by on nothing. He remembered the nights his mother skipped meals so he could eat, the cold winters when heat was a luxury. He remembered the shame of standing in classrooms with worn-out shoes and kids whispering behind his back. He had sworn he would never feel powerless again. And now, decades later, he saw himself in Daniel. The whiskey burned down his throat, but it didn't dull the ache in his chest. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Jonathan called his assistant. "Clear my schedule this afternoon," he ordered. "Sir?" she asked, confused. "You have 3 back-to-back meetings, including—" "Clear it," he repeated, his tone brooking no argument. "And find out everything you can about a woman named Claire Miller." There was a pause. "May I ask why?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. "Because I owe a boy more than just a pair of shoes." When the report landed on his desk, Jonathan read it slowly. Every detail, every struggle. Claire Miller, 32, working 2 jobs, raising her son alone in a cramped apartment in one of the city's tougher neighborhoods. No criminal record, no debts except medical bills from when Daniel had been hospitalized with pneumonia 2 years ago. Jonathan closed the file, his chest tight. He had built skyscrapers, toppled competitors, and bent markets to his will. But none of it made him feel the way that simple file did, because it reminded him of how easily life could break the ones who fought the hardest. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hale decided to get personally involved. Jonathan arrived at the modest apartment building just before sunset. It was the kind of place he hadn't stepped into since his own childhood. Peeling paint on the stairwell, the scent of damp concrete, doors with locks that looked fragile against the world outside. His polished shoes sounded almost out of place on the cracked floor as he climbed the stairs. Claire answered the door cautiously, her brows knitting together when she saw him standing there. She hadn't expected him to come in person. For a moment, she almost shut the door again. "Mr. Hale?" she asked, her voice wary. Jonathan inclined his head. "I wanted to check in, to see how Daniel's shoes fit. May I?" Her instinct was to refuse. But before she could, Daniel's voice came from behind her. "Mom, it's him!" The boy appeared, wearing the sneakers, his face lit with excitement. He ran to the doorway, nearly tripping in his eagerness. "They fit perfect," Daniel exclaimed, grinning up at Jonathan. "Look, I can run without the bottoms falling off." He dashed down the hallway and back, his laughter filling the cramped space. Jonathan smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the hard edges of his face. "They look good on you, Daniel. They suit you." Claire folded her arms, her body tense. "You didn't have to come here." "No," Jonathan agreed, "but I wanted to." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Claire, may I speak with you privately?" She led him into the small kitchen, while Daniel busied himself with a sketch pad at the table. The linoleum was worn, the cupboards chipped, but everything was neatly kept, clean despite its age. Jonathan's gaze lingered on the space before returning to her. I had my assistant look into your situation. Her eyes narrowed instantly. You what? I needed to understand, Jonathan said calmly. You're working 2 jobs, barely enough to cover expenses, and you're carrying medical debt from your son's hospitalization. Her jaw tightened. That's none of your business. You're right, Jonathan admitted. But I want to help. Claire's shoulders stiffened. I told you before I don't want charity. It isn't charity, Jonathan said, his tone firm but gentle. It's recognition. You're doing everything you can, and it still isn't enough. That isn't failure. That's the system failing you. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked hard, forcing the tears away. Jonathan softened his voice. When I was Daniel's age, I had shoes just like his. Worse, maybe. I know how it feels to be laughed at for something you can't control. And I know what it does to a child. I swore that if I ever had the power to change that for someone else, I would. Claire stared at him, conflicted. Every instinct screamed to push him away, to guard herself and her son from disappointment. But something about the way he spoke, the raw truth in his voice, made her hesitate. What exactly are you offering? She asked finally. Jonathan held her gaze. A chance, for you, for Daniel. Let me help him into a school where he won't be mocked for what he wears. Let me help you clear those debts so you can breathe again. And if you'll allow me, let me invest in his future, not as a business deal, not as a transaction, but as a promise. Claire's breath caught. She shook her head, almost laughing bitterly. Why us? Out of everyone in this city, why stop for him? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Because I saw myself in him. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. From the kitchen doorway, Daniel's small voice piped up. Mom, can he? Claire turned to look at her son, his hopeful eyes shining. He was clutching his sketch pad, holding it out as if it were evidence in Jonathan's favor. The drawing was crude but full of heart. 3 stick figures holding hands, one small boy, one tall man in a suit, and a woman in the middle, smiling. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had seen deals worth billions, contracts with signatures that shook industries, but no piece of paper had ever carried the weight of that simple drawing. Claire pressed her lips together, torn between fear and the undeniable truth staring back at her. She had spent years carrying everything alone, and now for the first time, someone with power wasn't looking past her. He was looking directly at her and her son. She closed her eyes for a long moment, then exhaled. All right, she whispered, but I need you to understand this doesn't make us yours to own. Jonathan nodded. I wouldn't want it to. And just like that, the first fragile thread of trust was woven between them. The days that followed unfolded with a strangeness Claire couldn't quite name. For years, her routine had been carved in stone. Wake early, work the morning shift at the diner, rest for barely an hour before heading to clean offices at night, collapse into bed long after midnight. Every penny counted, every hour mattered. But now Jonathan Hale's presence lingered like a shadow over her life, bending routines that had seemed unbreakable. The first shift came when a sleek black car pulled up outside their apartment on a Wednesday morning. Claire had just tied her apron for work when there was a knock at the door. Daniel answered before she could stop him, his face lighting up as Jonathan stepped inside. Good morning, Jonathan said smoothly, but his eyes softened when they landed on Daniel. I thought I'd walk you to school today. Daniel beamed. Really? Claire bristled. That's not necessary. Jonathan looked at her steadily. I know, but I'd like to. She hesitated, her instincts caught between suspicion and something softer. Against her better judgment, she nodded. Daniel practically danced into his new shoes, grabbed his backpack, and slipped his hand into Jonathan's without hesitation. Claire watched them go, her chest tightening with a mix of unease and gratitude. At the schoolyard, whispers followed them. Children stared at the expensive car parked at the curb, then at Daniel holding the hand of a man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. Even Marcus, the ringleader, shrank back when Jonathan's eyes swept across him. "Stand tall, Daniel," Jonathan said as they reached the gate. "Not because of me, because you deserve to." Daniel straightened his shoulders, something he had never dared to do before. Jonathan left him at the entrance, but not before resting a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "Remember, you're worth more than what anyone says about you." When Daniel walked into the building, there was no laughter this time, only silence. And for the first time, Daniel felt something close to pride. Claire heard about it that evening from Daniel himself, who recounted every detail with sparkling eyes. He had never spoken about school with excitement before. He even showed her a drawing he'd made in class, a man in a suit with his hand on a boy's shoulder, standing tall. Claire studied the drawing long after Daniel had gone to bed. She couldn't ignore what she saw. Her son was changing, carrying himself differently, smiling more. Jonathan had done in days what she hadn't been able to do in years. That truth stung her pride, but it also filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The second shift came when Jonathan invited them both to dinner, not at a lavish restaurant, but at a quiet family-owned place tucked in a corner of the city. Claire had expected something extravagant, something that would make her feel out of place. But the small restaurant smelled of garlic and fresh bread, the tables worn with years of stories. Jonathan pulled out a chair for her, a simple gesture that caught her off guard. She wasn't used to being treated with that kind of respect. Daniel chattered endlessly, showing Jonathan his drawings, talking about the kids at school, even laughing at his own stories. Jonathan listened, really listened. His phone stayed in his pocket the entire evening, a rare thing for a man whose empire lived in constant demand. His eyes never strayed from Claire and Daniel, as if this dinner was more important than any deal waiting in his inbox. At one point, Claire excused herself to the restroom, leaving Jonathan alone with Daniel. The boy leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Do you think you'll always be around?" Daniel asked. Jonathan paused, his throat tightening. He thought of his own father, the empty chair at the table, the promises never kept. He looked at Daniel, a boy who had already learned too much about absence. "Yes," Jonathan said firmly. "As long as you'll have me, Daniel, I'll be here." Daniel's smile in that moment was worth more than every contract Jonathan had ever signed. When Claire returned, she noticed something in her son's face, a lightness, a trust she hadn't seen in years. It frightened her how quickly he had opened his heart to this man. And yet, watching Jonathan laugh at one of Daniel's clumsy jokes, she couldn't deny the warmth that stirred in her chest. That night, after dinner, Jonathan walked them to their apartment. He lingered at the doorway, his eyes steady on Claire. "You're stronger than you know," he said quietly, "but even the strongest people deserve someone in their corner." Claire swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. She wanted to tell him to leave, to remind him they didn't need saving. But the words caught in her throat. Because deep down, she knew Daniel did need someone like him. And maybe, just maybe, so did she. Jonathan left with a polite nod, disappearing into the night. But his words lingered long after the door closed. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan became a fixture in their lives. Not an intruder, but a presence. He helped Daniel with homework, taught him how to tie a proper knot in his shoelaces, even showed up at one of his school art shows. The teachers whispered about it, parents speculated, but Jonathan ignored them all. For him, this wasn't about appearances. It was about redemption. Because every time he looked at Daniel, he didn't just see a boy in need. He saw the boy he once had been. And every time he looked at Claire, he saw a strength he remembered in his mother, a strength that deserved more than the world had given. It wasn't long before whispers began to follow Jonathan, too. Board members questioned his distractions. Business partners wondered why he was investing time in a single mother and her child instead of mergers and acquisitions. But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in decades, he was investing in something that couldn't be measured in numbers, something real. And though none of them knew it yet, the bond forming in that small apartment was about to change all of their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. Jonathan's life began to split in two. By day, he was still the CEO whose signature could send markets trembling, the man with private jets, penthouse views, and a team of assistants ready to anticipate his every move. But in the evenings, in that cramped little apartment with peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture, he became someone else. Daniel greeted him like family now, running to the door the moment his polished shoes clicked in the hallway. They would sit on the floor together, Daniel with crayons scattered across the carpet, Jonathan in shirt sleeves, laughing as the boy explained every detail of his drawings. Sometimes Daniel would try to copy Jonathan's signature from the card he'd given him, looping letters awkwardly, and Jonathan would guide his hand gently, showing him how each line curved. Claire watched from the kitchen more often than she admitted, her arms folded, pretending to focus on dishes while her heart betrayed her. She wasn't sure when Jonathan had become part of their evenings. She hadn't invited it, at least not outright. But he came, and with him came a steadiness she hadn't realized she craved. One Thursday evening, after a long shift at the diner, Claire walked into the apartment to find Jonathan sitting cross-legged on the floor, teaching Daniel how to play chess. The boy's face was scrunched in concentration, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he moved a knight. "You think that's the right move?" Jonathan asked, smiling faintly. Daniel nodded eagerly. Jonathan's eyes gleamed with pride. "Then trust yourself. Never second-guess when you've thought it through." Claire leaned against the doorframe, exhausted but strangely comforted. No man had ever sat on her floor teaching her son lessons with that kind of patience. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Jonathan lingered. He stood by the window, looking out at the dim street lights, his hands in his pockets. Claire joined him, her hair damp from a quick shower, the faint scent of soap clinging to her. "You don't have to keep coming here," she said quietly. "You've done enough already." Jonathan turned his head toward her. "Do you want me to stop?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked down instead, fiddling with the hem of her worn sweater. "I don't know what I want." Jonathan's voice softened. "Then let me stay until you do." For the first time, she didn't argue. The weeks bled into months, and with them came subtle changes. Daniel's confidence grew at school. The boy who once kept his head down now volunteered to read aloud in class. He raised his hand to answer questions. He even stood up to Marcus once, not with fists, but with words sharp enough to silence him. The teachers noticed, the other parents noticed, and so did Claire. One evening, as she tucked Daniel into bed, he whispered, "Mom, it feels like we're not alone anymore." Her throat tightened. She kissed his forehead and whispered back, "No, we're not." But with Jonathan's presence came something else. Attention. Neighbors whispered about the expensive car outside the building. Co-workers asked questions Claire didn't know how to answer. At the diner, two regulars nudged each other when Jonathan walked in one morning just to have coffee at her section. "Is that the Jonathan Hale?" one of them whispered loudly. Claire flushed, feeling exposed. She didn't want to be a headline in someone else's gossip. That night she confronted him. "You can't keep showing up everywhere like this," she said, her voice tight. "People are talking." Jonathan didn't flinch. "Let them talk." "You don't understand," she snapped. "I've spent years keeping my head down, keeping Daniel safe. I don't need attention. I don't need rumors. I don't need people thinking I'm some woman who caught a rich man's eye for handouts." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his voice steady but fierce. "This isn't about handouts. It's about partnership. It's about giving you what you've always deserved: breathing room, dignity, a chance to live instead of just survive. If people want to twist that, let them. The truth won't change." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, torn between anger and the strange ache his words stirred in her. She hated how much she wanted to believe him. That night, long after Jonathan had gone, Claire sat awake at the kitchen table, staring at Daniel's drawings pinned to the fridge. Most of them now included Jonathan, sometimes tall, with a crooked smile, sometimes holding hands with Daniel, sometimes standing beside her. In every drawing, they were together, and for the first time Claire let herself wonder if maybe that's what they already were. Jonathan, too, felt the shift. In boardrooms, he found his mind wandering. Numbers blurred on spreadsheets, charts meant to project growth seemed hollow. His empire no longer felt like the victory it once had. He began delegating more, trusting his executives to carry deals he once would have controlled with an iron grip. Grace, his longtime assistant, noticed first. "You've changed," she said one afternoon, dropping a stack of reports on his desk. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Have I?" She crossed her arms, smirking. "You smile more. You cancel meetings without guilt. And last week you rescheduled a lunch with 2 billionaires because Daniel had a school play. Who are you, and what have you done with Jonathan Hale?" Jonathan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Maybe I just remembered there's more to life than boardrooms." Grace studied him, her sharp eyes softening. "Whoever reminded you of that, don't lose them." That night, as Jonathan stood outside Claire's apartment with a bag of groceries in one hand and flowers in the other, he realized Grace was right. He had already lost too much time living in skyscrapers and empty penthouses. He wasn't going to lose this. And though he couldn't yet say the words aloud, Jonathan Hale knew the truth. This woman and her boy weren't just people he wanted to help. They were the family he hadn't known, he was searching for all along. Winter settled over the city like a heavy blanket, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made even the strongest shiver. For Claire, it meant longer shifts at the diner as more customers crowded in for warm meals and harder nights cleaning offices where the heating barely worked. For Daniel, it meant cracked hands, pink cheeks, and running through icy streets in shoes that, though new, were already worn from constant use. For Jonathan, winter meant facing a world of business as usual, stock markets, negotiations, corporate dinners, but feeling increasingly restless in it. Every gleaming ballroom and boardroom reminded him of what he used to value, and every time he stepped back into Claire's small apartment, he felt the contrast like a slap. One evening, snow still falling in fat flakes, Jonathan arrived to find Daniel asleep on the couch with a blanket pulled up to his chin. Crayons and scraps of paper surrounded him. Claire was at the table, her hair loose, a book in her hands. She looked up when Jonathan entered, exhaustion etched into her face. "You shouldn't keep coming here," she said quietly, though the bite in her words had softened with time. Jonathan set down the groceries he had brought. "And yet here I am," she sighed, shaking her head. "You don't owe us anything. Whatever this is, it doesn't make sense." Jonathan walked closer, his gaze steady. "Does it have to?" Claire's lips parted, then pressed together again. She looked down at the book in her hands, tracing the corner of the page with her thumb. "I've spent years learning not to depend on anyone. Every time I thought I could, I was wrong." Jonathan lowered his voice, each word deliberate. "I'm not them, Claire. I'm not here to take. I'm here because I want to give, because I see something worth standing beside." The vulnerability in his tone startled her. Men like him weren't supposed to sound like that, unguarded, raw. She wanted to push him away to protect herself, but a part of her couldn't, not anymore. Instead, she whispered, "Why us?" Jonathan looked at Daniel sleeping soundly on the couch, the boy's chest rising and falling with innocence unscarred by the world. Then he looked back at Claire. "Because I see myself in him," he said, "and I see my mother in you." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, Daniel stirred, blinking awake. He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "You came," he mumbled, smiling. Jonathan smiled back, softer than Claire had ever seen. "Of course I did." Daniel climbed into Jonathan's lap as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Within minutes, He was asleep again, head resting against Jonathan's chest. Jonathan sat perfectly still, afraid to move, his hand resting gently on the boy's back. Claire watched, her throat tight. For years she had carried everything alone, and now here was a man who seemed willing to carry some of the weight without asking for anything in return. That night, something shifted permanently, not in words, not in declarations, but in the quiet image of a millionaire CEO sitting in a worn apartment, holding a sleeping child as if he were the most valuable thing in the world. From that point on, Jonathan's involvement deepened. He didn't just bring groceries, he helped Daniel with school projects, paid attention to the small details Claire thought no one noticed. He replaced the drafty window in the living room without being asked, stocked the fridge when she worked late, and showed up at Daniel's school play, clapping louder than anyone. Whispers grew louder, too. At the diner, co-workers whispered behind Claire's back, speculating about the rich man who seemed to orbit her life. At school, parents muttered when Jonathan's sleek car pulled up beside the curb. Some admired, some envied, some sneered. Claire felt their stares, but Daniel didn't care. He only cared that someone showed up for him. One night after Daniel had gone to bed, Claire and Jonathan sat at the small kitchen table, the only light coming from a dim bulb overhead. Jonathan poured 2 cups of tea instead of whiskey, breaking his usual ritual. "You ever think," he said softly, "that life gives us second chances when we least expect them?" Claire studied him. "Second chances aren't free. They come with strings." Jonathan met her gaze. "Then let me prove there are no strings with me." She looked down, heart pounding in ways she hadn't felt in years. The walls she had built for survival began to crack piece by piece. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But for the first time, she let the silence between them feel less like distance and more like possibility. In the months that followed, Jonathan's empire shifted too. His board grew restless, murmuring about distractions, about priorities. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He began restructuring, delegating more, investing less in cold numbers and more in people, foundations for single parents, programs for children in poverty. His vision changed, not for shareholders, but for the lives no one else was watching. And it all started with a boy in broken shoes. What Jonathan didn't know yet, what even Claire couldn't see, was that this fragile new family would soon be tested in ways none of them expected, because not everyone welcomed the idea of a man like him stepping into a world he was never supposed to touch. The test came on a gray February morning. Claire was leaving her shift at the diner when she saw 2 women from her building whispering near the entrance. Their voices dropped the moment she walked by, but their glances said enough. By the time she reached her apartment, the whispers had grown into words. "You've really done it now," her neighbor, Mrs. Lopez, said bluntly, standing in the hallway with her arms crossed. "Bringing a man like that around here? People talk, Claire. They say you're chasing money." Claire froze, Daniel clutching her hand beside her. "Excuse me?" "They say you're letting him buy his way in. Shoes, groceries, rides in his car. Next thing, you'll be moving out with him. People don't like it." Claire's face burned. She wanted to snap back, but Daniel was staring at her with wide, worried eyes. Instead, she muttered, "It's none of their business," and guided him inside. But the words followed her long after the door shut. That evening, Jonathan arrived with takeout in hand, Daniel cheering at the sight of him. Claire, however, stayed cold. "Why are you here?" she asked as he set the food down. Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. "To have dinner. With you. With him." "Do you know what people are saying?" she demanded, her voice low but sharp. "That I'm letting you buy us. That I'm—" She cut herself off, too ashamed to finish the sentence. Jonathan's eyes darkened. "Claire, I've worked too hard," she snapped. "I've carried too much. I won't let anyone think I'm selling myself or my son for comfort." For a moment, silence filled the room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice firm but calm. Then tell me, Claire, have I ever asked for anything in return? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I don't want to own you, Jonathan said, his voice rough with emotion. I want to stand beside you, and if people can't see the difference, that's their problem, not ours. Her breath caught. She hated how much she wanted to believe him, how much she needed his words to be true. But trust was dangerous. It always had been. Jonathan softened, lowering his voice. Do you know what people said about my mother? That she was weak? That she was foolish for believing in someone who left her? But she wasn't weak. She was stronger than anyone I've ever known. And you remind me of her every time you walk out that door to work 2 jobs. You don't owe me explanations, Claire. You don't owe me anything. But don't you dare let their words make you smaller than you are. Claire's throat ached, tears threatening to break through the walls she'd built. She turned away, blinking rapidly. Daniel broke the silence first. He tugged Jonathan's sleeve. Can we eat now? Jonathan smiled faintly, ruffling the boy's hair. Of course, champ. Dinner passed quietly, but the air between Claire and Jonathan was charged, full of words unsaid. Later, after Daniel was asleep, Claire found Jonathan still at the table, papers spread before him, business documents, reports, things she didn't understand. You should go, she said softly. He looked up, eyes tired but steady. Not yet. She hesitated, then crossed the room. Why are you really doing this? Not the shoes, not the food. Us. Why? Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Finally he said, Because I spent my whole life building things that don't matter, and then I found something that does. Claire's breath hitched. She had no answer for that. She turned away, but the words sank deep, echoing long into the night. Jonathan left quietly, but the truth remained. He wasn't going anywhere. In the weeks that followed, his presence became more than just visits. He helped Daniel with a school science project, even staying up late, to help him build a shaky volcano model that sputtered baking soda all over the kitchen. He replaced the broken heater in Claire's apartment without asking, simply smiling when she confronted him. You can't keep fixing everything, she said. Maybe not everything, Jonathan replied. But the things I can, I will. Slowly, painfully, she began to let him. And just when life felt like it might finally steady, the past she thought she'd outrun came crashing back. Because Daniel's father, long gone and long silent, had heard whispers too, and he didn't like the idea of another man stepping into the place he had abandoned. The knock came late on a Friday evening. Claire was folding laundry at the kitchen table, while Daniel colored on the floor. Jonathan expected any moment with takeout from their favorite little Italian place. She almost didn't answer. It was after 9, and unexpected visitors were rare. But the knock came again, louder, more insistent. She opened the door and froze. A man leaned against the doorframe, his face half hidden beneath a hood. But she knew him instantly. The stubble, the smirk that once charmed her, the eyes that had long since turned cruel. Claire, he drawled, as if years hadn't passed. Long time, huh? Her chest tightened. What are you doing here? Daniel looked up from the floor, confusion flickering across his face. Mom, who is that? Her stomach twisted. She couldn't answer, not yet. The man grinned, lowering his hood. Hey, kid, bet you don't remember me? Daniel's brow furrowed. No. The man's smile faltered slightly, but he leaned closer to Claire. Word gets around. People saying you're cozying up with some big-shot rich guy. Thought I'd come see for myself. You always did like rescuers, didn't you? Claire's hand shook, but her voice came out sharp. You need to leave. Now. Before the man could reply, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jonathan's steady stride, confident and calm, carrying a paper bag that smelled of garlic bread and pasta. When he turned the corner, the air changed. His eyes swept over the scene in an instant. The fear in Claire's face, Daniel's small frame tense behind her, the stranger smirking in the doorway. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Who are you? He asked, his tone deceptively quiet. The man straightened, squaring his shoulders. Name's Eric. I'm his father. He jerked his chin toward Daniel. Jonathan's expression didn't shift, but his presence filled the hallway like a storm gathering strength. "Then you're the man who walked away." Eric's smirk faltered. "You don't know anything about me." Jonathan stepped closer, his voice low, deliberate. "I know enough. You weren't here when your son needed shoes. You weren't here when he was sick or when she worked herself raw to keep him fed. You don't get to show up now and call yourself his father." Claire's breath caught. No one had ever spoken those words aloud before, not with such certainty. Eric sneered. "And who are you? Some suit who thinks he can buy a family? You think throwing money around makes you a better man than me?" Jonathan's eyes burned cold. "No, showing up does." The two men stared at each other, tension crackling like electricity. For a moment, Claire thought Eric might lunge, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He didn't need to. His calm was sharper than any threat. Finally, Eric scoffed. "This isn't over." He shoved his hands into his pockets and stalked down the hall, muttering curses under his breath. Jonathan didn't move until the echo of footsteps faded completely. Then he turned to Claire, his voice gentler. "Are you all right?" Her throat tightened, tears threatening. She nodded quickly, though her hands trembled. Daniel tugged Jonathan's sleeve, his voice small. "Is he really my dad?" Jonathan knelt down, eye level with the boy. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. "He's the man who helped bring you into the world, but a father is someone who stays, someone who shows up every day. That's what matters." Daniel's eyes searched his face. "Like you?" Jonathan swallowed hard, emotion flickering across his features. He gave a small nod. "Like me." Claire's chest ached at the sight. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something that could capture the flood of feelings overwhelming her. But words failed. That night, as Daniel slept curled safely in his bed, Jonathan and Claire sat at the kitchen table in silence. The untouched takeout had gone cold, but neither cared. "He'll be back," Claire whispered finally, her voice raw. "Eric doesn't show up without a reason. He'll want something." Jonathan's gaze was steady, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. "Then he'll have to go through me." For the first time since opening that door, Claire let herself breathe, because she realized she wasn't standing alone anymore. Days turned into a week, and though Eric hadn't returned, the shadow of his presence lingered like a storm cloud over Claire's small apartment. She carried the weight of it silently, trying not to let Daniel see her fear, but Jonathan noticed. He always noticed. One evening, while Daniel was busy in his room building a cardboard fort, Jonathan sat across from Claire at the kitchen table. The glow of the single overhead light cast shadows under her tired eyes. She tried to busy herself with bills, sorting them into neat piles, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she lifted each envelope. "You're still thinking about him?" Jonathan said quietly. Claire froze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm thinking about what happens if he comes back." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "Then we deal with it. Together." She shook her head, frustration breaking through. "You don't understand. Eric doesn't just want attention. He wants control. He'll drag us through the mud if he thinks he can. He'll use Daniel as leverage, and I can't—" Her voice cracked. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking. Jonathan rose without hesitation, moving around the table to kneel beside her. His hands rested lightly on her arms. "Claire, look at me." She lowered her hands slowly, tears clinging to her lashes. "He left you," Jonathan said, his voice low, deliberate. "He abandoned his son. That's not control, that's cowardice. If he comes back trying to play father now, he'll have to prove himself to the courts, to the world. And I will not let him hurt you or Daniel again." Her breath hitched. "You say that like you can fix everything." Jonathan held her gaze, his jaw tight. "I can't fix everything, but I can stand with you while you fight, and I promise I won't walk away." For a moment, silence wrapped around them. Claire searched his face for any hint of insincerity, any crack in his conviction, but all she found was truth. She swallowed hard. "I'm not used to anyone standing beside me." "Then get used to it," he murmured. Before she could respond, Daniel came running into the kitchen, his cardboard crown slipping sideways on his head. "Mom, Jonathan, you have to see my fort. It's a castle!" Jonathan stood, his expression softening instantly. "A castle, huh? Lead the way, Your Majesty." Daniel giggled, tugging Jonathan's hand as he dragged him toward his room. Claire watched them go, her heart caught in her throat. Later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep inside his castle, Jonathan lingered at the door, watching him breathe softly. Claire joined him, arms folded, leaning against the doorframe. "He loves you," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Jonathan turned to her, emotion flickering in his eyes. "And I love him." Her chest tightened. It was the first time he had said it aloud, and hearing it shook her more than she expected. Back in the kitchen, she whispered, "You're risking everything, you know. Your name, your company. For us." Jonathan shrugged slightly, though his voice carried the weight of truth. "For once in my life, I'm risking something that matters." Claire had no answer. She only knew that the man standing in her kitchen was no longer just the millionaire CEO she had met in that schoolyard. He was something more, something dangerous, because she could feel herself beginning to trust him. And trust, she knew, could break her as surely as it could save her. What none of them realized was that Eric hadn't gone far. He was watching from a distance, waiting, calculating, and when he came back, it wouldn't be for conversation. It would be for war. The storm arrived 2 weeks later. It was a Saturday morning, and Daniel was still in pajamas, building Lego towers on the living room rug. Claire had just brewed a pot of coffee, savoring the brief quiet. Jonathan was there too, wearing a sweater instead of one of his tailored suits, kneeling on the floor to help Daniel balance a tower taller than both of them. The sight almost felt unreal to Claire. This man, who usually graced magazine covers and television interviews, sitting cross-legged on her old rug, grinning when plastic bricks toppled into a pile. The knock at the door shattered the peace. Claire's stomach dropped instantly. She knew. Even before she opened it, she knew. Eric pushed inside before she could speak, his presence filling the apartment with chaos. His eyes were bloodshot, his jacket worn, his expression carrying the smug arrogance of someone who thought the world still owed him. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he sneered, looking from Jonathan to Claire to Daniel. "Family night with the millionaire. Tell me, Claire, how long until he decides you're not worth the charity?" Daniel froze, shrinking behind Jonathan, his small hands gripping Jonathan's arm. Jonathan rose slowly, calm but unyielding, his height dwarfing Eric's. "You weren't invited," he said evenly. Eric scoffed. "Neither were you. But here you are playing house with my kid." "He's not your kid," Jonathan replied, his voice quiet but sharp as glass. "He's a boy you abandoned." Eric's smirk faltered, but he leaned closer, his voice dripping venom. "You think money makes you a father? You think showing up a few times buys you the right? I can take him back whenever I want. The courts listen to blood, not strangers in suits." Claire's chest tightened, but before she could speak, Jonathan stepped forward, his presence radiating power. "Try it," he said, his voice like steel. "Try to drag this boy into a life where you disappear for years at a time, where his mother works herself to death because you couldn't stay. Try to convince a judge that blood is more important than love, than presence, than sacrifice. You'll lose." Eric's fists clenched, his bravado cracking. For a moment Claire feared he would swing, but Jonathan didn't flinch. He stood tall, unwavering, a wall of calm fury. Daniel's voice broke the silence, small but steady. "I don't want to go with you." Eric's eyes snapped to him. "You don't even know me." Daniel shook his head. "I know enough. You weren't here. He was." He looked up at Jonathan, his eyes filled with trust. "He's my dad." The words hit harder than any punch could. Eric's face twisted, rage and humiliation warring inside him. "This isn't over," he spat, backing toward the door. "You'll regret crossing me." The door slammed, leaving a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Claire's hands shook as she steadied herself on the counter. "He's going to make trouble," she whispered. "He always does." Jonathan turned to her, his expression firm. "Then, we'll be ready." He looked down at Daniel, who still clung to him. His voice softened. "You're safe, Daniel. No one is taking you away. Not now. Not ever." Daniel nodded, burying his face against Jonathan's side. For Claire, the fear lingered, but so did something stronger. Watching Jonathan hold her son with such quiet certainty, she felt the fragile beginnings of trust settle deeper. Eric might come back. He might fight. But this time, she wasn't standing alone. This time, she had someone who had chosen them. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of love. And for the first time in years, she believed they might actually win. The fallout came faster than Claire expected. 3 days after Eric's intrusion, a letter arrived in the mail, sealed in an envelope with the county courthouse stamp. Claire tore it open with trembling fingers and felt the blood drain from her face. Petition for custody. Her hands shook as she sank into a chair. Daniel was in his room, humming quietly to himself as he worked on another drawing. She didn't want him to see. She didn't want him to know. When Jonathan arrived that evening, she pressed the papers into his hands, her voice breaking. "He's trying to take him. He's actually trying." Jonathan read every line carefully, his jaw tightening with each word. When he looked up, his eyes were burning with something fierce. "He doesn't stand a chance." Claire laughed bitterly, though it cracked in the middle. "You don't know him. He's manipulative. He'll say whatever he has to say. And me? I'm just a waitress who cleans offices at night. What judge is going to look at me and see more than exhaustion?" Jonathan reached across the table, taking her trembling hands in his. "They'll see a mother who's never left her child's side. They'll see a boy who knows exactly who's been raising him. And they'll see me standing beside you." Her throat tightened. "You can't buy the law, Jonathan." His voice softened, steady but unshakable. "No, but I can shine a light on the truth, and truth wins when it's not buried." The next week became a blur of preparation. Jonathan called in his most trusted legal team, not the sharks who tore through corporate rivals, but advocates who specialized in family law, people who cared about children more than they cared about billable hours. He spared no expense, but he also spared no detail. Every hospital record, every school attendance sheet, every photograph of Daniel's life without his father became part of the file. At first, Claire resisted. "I don't want my life dissected. I don't want strangers digging into every mistake I've ever made." Jonathan's gaze was gentle but firm. "They're not digging for mistakes. They're building the story of who you are, and that story matters." Through it all, Daniel sensed more than they told him. One night, while Claire was folding laundry and Jonathan was reviewing documents at the kitchen table, Daniel climbed onto Jonathan's lap with his sketch pad. "Will I have to go live with him?" he asked quietly. Jonathan set the papers aside and wrapped an arm around the boy. "No, because family isn't decided by paperwork. It's decided by who shows up every single day. And you already know who that is." Daniel leaned his head against Jonathan's chest. "I want to stay with you, with Mom. I don't want him." Jonathan swallowed hard, his hand resting on Daniel's back. "Then that's what we'll fight for, together." Claire watched them, her vision blurring. She wanted to tell Jonathan not to make promises he couldn't keep, but something inside her believed him, believed that with him standing beside them, they had a chance. The court date arrived on a gray morning that smelled of rain. Claire dressed carefully, her hands trembling as she buttoned her blouse. Jonathan was already waiting in the living room, crisp in a suit, calm in a way that steadied her. "You're not alone," he reminded her, offering his arm. At the courthouse, Eric stood with his lawyer, looking smug, polished for the first time in years. He glanced at Jonathan, then at Claire, and smirked as if victory were already his. But when the hearing began, it was Jonathan's quiet presence that shifted the air. He wasn't there as the millionaire CEO. He was there as the man who had been in Daniel's life every day, the man who had chosen them. And when Daniel's small voice echoed in the courtroom, steady and clear, "I want to stay with my mom, and I want him to stay too," the silence that followed was heavier than any argument Eric's lawyer could muster. Claire's eyes filled with tears as Jonathan rested a steady hand on her back. For the first time in years, she believed the truth might finally matter. And for the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale realized what it truly meant to fight for something worth more than all the money in the world.